Hi, welcome to the Witch in the Woods, and today I've been wanting to talk about a subject for a long time, and this is the local folk practices of our ancestors, things that we've often forgotten even happened, and how much this indicates that our ancestors were actually practicing witchcraft in the past, or practicing some kind of magical rites and rituals. That's what I'm going to be talking about here when I talk about some evidence of apotropaic magic. Questioning the historical pagan evidence from the past is a difficult problem. We are working right up from early pagan medieval times right up to a modern pagan revival, and often we have very little evidence and a lot of supposition about magical practices in the past. Were our ancestors really actually paying tribute to old gods and old ways, and only really paying lip service to Christianity? Or is there actually no historical evidence of pagan practices in the past, relying as it does on unreliable confessions under torture and coercion? So when we consider this question, we have to consider many angles, circumstances, and later biases. There are mention of witch trials in the historical records. These are often dismissed as the workings of paranoid and persecutory minds, a superstitious population and very primitive mindset. Particularly mentioned is the fear and persecution of women and socially reviled people, and this sort of arose as hysteria around the 16th century and is now somewhat embarrassing to us. Much of this discourse centres around the persecution of innocent women and misogyny as a plague that spread throughout medieval Europe. What is noted too is that Europe at this time was suffering from a blight. The crops and harvests were failed, we were experiencing a climatic change, and there was a mini ice age. This led to a lot of fear and paranoia as well. In an interesting article in the National Post,
the National Post says of the time in its article, "Modern day witch hunts led by the climate change faithful," that witch hunts in mid-millennial Europe were inextricably linked with concerns over climate change. This was the era of the Little Ice Age, the period that roughly spanned from 1300 to 1850, during which the Northern Hemisphere had experienced exceptionally cold winters. The impact of the Little Ice Age was devastating. The frigid weather violently disrupted harvests in Europe, especially the grain harvest. Following particularly cold periods in the 1500s, it took 180 years for grain harvests to return to their previous levels. The result, in the words of German historian Philipp Blom, was a long-term continental-wide agricultural crisis, and this led to a staggering spike in witch hunts. Blom describes how in Northern Europe in particular, the accumulation of bad harvests and the constant fear of famine and illness led to the rise of a particularly cruel collective hysteria, witch trials. Thousands of women and occasionally men were burnt for their alleged role in stoking contrary weather in causing climate change.
now, it's my belief that there was a very real fear of village witches, village magical practitioners, cunning folk, and this led to a suspicion amongst a community as to who could be trusted and who could not be trusted. Those who were deemed to be cunning practitioners, sellers of spells, those who flouted the authority of religion blatantly, were now in a position of being accused and being blamed for blighting the luck and fertility of the very land itself. Now, witches were thought to harm while cunning folk healed, and there was a distinct definition. The cunning folk were said to help with healing charms and spells to protect people against baneful magic and harm of their crops and harm of their livelihoods. But now in these eras, the suspicion was placed very firmly upon these people.
Cunning comes from the Old English root word cunning, which means to have power or to know, and means very much as cunning does today, as in also wise and knowledgeable and almost stealthy. but without the association of sneaky or corrupt as we might consider it today. The Cunning folk were traditional practitioners who worked healing spells, charms and cures, but their magics were also often feared and awesome, like those practiced by the notorious toadmen, those in possession of toad bone, acquired with ritual acts and contracts with Old Nick or the devil. Their power was feared and believed to be very real.
Going back to the witch trials, now considered an embarrassing and socially reprehensible part of human evolution, with terrible ravings such as people meeting the devil in the form of a hare or flying through the sky at night, and these just seem like ramblings of paranoia and judgmental accusation, and they just seem ridiculous to us now. But one of the most notorious witch trials began under Pendle Hill at Newchurch in Lancashire, with the cursing of a pedlar by a beggar girl.
Alison Devizes was walking among the lanes one day about Pendle Hill in Lancashire when she met a tinker. She asked the man if he would give her some pins, to which he declined. She walked on muttering a curse in behind her when something happened. The pedlar immediately suffered some illness. One part of his eye started being distorted and his face kind of went a bit strange and drooped. He fell to the ground. The girl then reflected on her actions with horror, as she knew that she was the granddaughter of a cunning woman, old Demdike as she was known locally, who used such spells and charms that could help or harm. She returned to the tinker asking for forgiveness and taking upon herself all the guilt that she may have felt at the collapse of an elderly man. This is because she truly believed that she had the power of a witch, taught to her by her grandmother, old Demdike.
Now, this is often glossed over, in my opinion, in the telling of the Pendle witch trials. Many historians like to point out the outrageous persecution of innocent women. I would like to point out that not all of these women were entirely innocent, and that the very situation itself was caused by a girl believing that she had magical powers passed on to her by her cunning woman grandmother, old Demdike. So in this case, very definitely one of those people had indeed been practicing what we might call witchcraft. The story goes on that many innocent people were then accused, and there were accusations of a feast at Malkin Towers that involved very noble members of the community who were then seized and tried and taken to Lancashire and imprisoned. Ultimately, the case cemented on the accusations of a 9-year-old girl against her own mother and her own brother. Now, there's a lot of historical things to be said about using children in trials and the susceptibility of children. These are all quite incomprehensible to us, how a child could accuse her own mother, unless it was possibly through coercion and threats. The wealthy and distinguished Nutter family were accused most famously, and eventually they were all taken away for trial. Old Demdike died in prison. 12 people were accused, and except for one, they were all found guilty and hanged. The clerk of the court, called Thomas Potts, wrote about it, which is why it's quite famous to this day, in his published book, The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster. Though the story is incredulous to us, the residents of Malkin Tower were also indistinguished, reviled and disliked people, and so it seized the popular imagination to call these people witches. The question is, I wonder, what was the prevalence of witchcraft in these rural societies? Were these people just healers and charmers and sellers of spells, or was there something much more significant going on, especially around the Pendle witch trial here? So the question I'd like to ask is, what evidence is there really of witchcraft in rural societies? Is the fear of witchcraft only ignorance and paranoia, or was there something very real happening in these communities that people found themselves afraid of? To address that, I'd like to bring in Brian Hoggard and his lovely book, Magical House Protection, the Archaeology of Counter Witchcraft. And as he suggests in his book, we may have to turn away from presupposition and documents that we found a little sort of dubious, as in the witchcraft trials, and maybe turn to archaeology and real physical evidence to find out what evidence there is of witchcraft in our previous generations. When it comes to magic and ritual evidence, what we find we can often attribute to apotropaic magic. Now, some of these finds are very curious, and we can only really see them in light of terms of ritual acts of house protection. We know very little about what spells, what words, what acts were performed when they created this rite. We can only guess at those kind of things. Some other objects, we can only speculate what they were used for. One good example is the witch's ladder, only one ever having been found in an attic. It was a curious find of a long string with feathers attached to it, and it was immediately attributed to magical protection. It was also cynically debunked as nothing more than a bird scarer for peas. So when we're faced with these items, we have to watch what we can read into certain finds and certain symbolic attributes. But some finds are indeed so odd that we can only really suppose that there was some ritual act of magic attributed to it. These acts of protection we call apotropaic magic.
Apotropaic comes from the Greek word apotropo, to ward off, and are markings and symbols often found on doors, windows, hearths and roof beams. These are places of entry and as such regarded as liminal worlds, places where two worlds meet. So markings that were designed to turn away the evil eye or black magic often seem to be placed here. This not only applies to home but to churches, outbuildings and barns, and even entrances to the underworld such as caves. Many look innocuous, like candle marks or scratches, but they are there in so many different places that it is hard to deny that the practice was happening. But what can be said is that there is a correlation among these artefacts and finds all across the country. Seemingly then, there is an occurrence in the Middle and later ages of a knowledge and law that was widespread in relation to magic and witchcraft.
But before we go on, this kind of implies that witches' marks or witches' markings were made by witches. This is not in fact the case. The witches' marks refer to marks and symbols that were made to protect from witches. So generally they were created by the common practitioner, the common person, against the evil effects of baneful magic. This, however, does imply that witches were prevalent in the countryside and were around your homes and your buildings and your livestock and your very livelihood itself, and could work baneful magic against you and ill-wish you. Another very important thing to bear in mind at this time was the English Reformation and the antagonism between Puritanism and the Catholic faith. In fact, the Catholic faith was seen as witchcraft at this time. The idolatry, the Catholic prayers and the summoning of specific demons were all considered to be heretical by the Reformation, by the Puritans, who saw God as much more pure and were suspicious of the strange rites and rituals enacted in a foreign language with a very pagan overtones that they associated with Catholicism. So the Pendle witches of 1612 were most famously of Lancashire, and Lancashire at this time was hiding Catholicism in its ranks. After the 1715 Jacobite uprising, many Scotsmen fled to Lancashire, finding that it would be a safe haven where they could hide out in the hills and the moors, and they would be sympathetically accepted. To this day, Lancashire has a higher population of Catholics than any other county. So Lancashire was prominently pro-Catholic at this time, and the secret hiding of priests, the secret saying of Mass, the secret gathering of Catholics was flaunted in Lancashire. So after the Act of Uniformity in 1559, these Catholics continued to flout the law against the saying of Catholic Mass. After this time, any Catholics who continued in their allegiance to Rome and not to the new church and to the head of the state were seen as traitors at this time. Ultimately, Elizabeth I was declared heretic by the Pope in 1570. Catholicism was considered a pagan religion by the Puritans, and this had something to do with the idolatry and the summoning of spirits. Things like the taking of the Eucharist, the exorcism of demons, these were all considered very magical witchcraft practices in the new eyes of the new church. The eating of Christ's body, the drinking of his blood were considered basic primal pagan rituals. They were accused of summoning evil spirits and demonic possession. It could be said that Puritanism gave rise to the suspicion of witchcraft, but that it was a religious persecution and a question of religious faith as well. So many of what are known as witch marks are actually very Christian in their design, but it was a Christianity that was of the old faith, that was of Catholicism. And so these became associated with dark and suspect practices of barbaric and unrefined practices to a new enlightened era. However, these practices did blatantly get continued by the common folk right up through the Puritan era, and so it was much harder to kill the old religion than it was to just change faith. So among these markings can be found many Christian symbols, but some can be considered older and much more pagan. They seem to have come through Egypt, Greece and Rome into Catholicism. One of these symbols is what we know as the daisy wheel, and this is a 6-petaled flower, or the hexafoil.
Among these markings can be found many religious symbols. Some may be considered pagan as they come from Egyptian or earlier sources, such as the flower of life, which appeared first on the Assyrian at Abydos in Egypt, which is 6,000 years old, and a temple to Osiris. Osiris, as the vegetation god, could be seen as a metaphor in connection to Christ and his journey of death and resurrection.
And this symbol became associated with Christ, but its earliest manifestation is in Egypt at the Temple of Abydos. The Temple of Abydos is 6,000 years old and is a temple to Osiris. And Osiris can be seen as connected to Christ in his vegetation god role through death and resurrection. So this symbol has endured and continued and been used as a protective marking right up until the early 19th century. This 6-pointed flower is said to be a symbol of the sun, but this is much disputed by historians who don't like this interpretation, although it is quite popular amongst pagans. Drunvalo Melchizedek has written quite a lot on the flower of life, as he called it, or the seed of life, which is the initial seed that becomes a bigger geometric design. Now this is less historical, it's based on some historical evidence and a lot of unverified personal gnosis, but he has explored in his books the way the seed of life, which is concentric circles, the 6 petals initially, can expand into the flower of life, which can expand into all the geometrical solids, which can contain all of creation in these perfect geometrical solids, which we know as the Platonic solids, which can all be mapped out within its design. So this is very interesting, and this is another aspect which you may want to go and explore further. Historians, on the other hand, tend to debate the flower as a geometric design that is an endless loop, that is an endless path, that has no beginning or no end, and like concentric circles that are often found interlapping, can trap the evil spirits on an endless journey, a path that never ends, a spirit trap. There are other symbols which are things like crossed lines to block or trap spirits. These can also be seen as the cross symbol of Christ. There are stars which shine out the brightness that dispels evil spirits. There are even some designs that look like ropes and knots of ropes, which can trap evil spirits again. So these are various witch markings that can be found. Now, among the religious symbols, there are the symbols that refer to Roman Catholicism, such as the Marian Marks, which are the symbol of the Virgin Mary or the goddess. W's and the V marks are called Marian Marks, and these are like intercrossed lines that form an invocation to the protection of the Virgin Mary. So the M and the W symbol seems to be interchangeable, both invocating Mary for the M or the Virgo Virginum, the Virgin of Virgins, is another way of seeing the W symbol. Now, when these were first seen, they were just mistaken for graffiti, people marking their signature on the wall. But they were also found scratched into church doors and by windows, on roof beams, by hearths. They became quite conspicuous, and particularly prevalent were the Virgin Mary symbols. The fact that they were scratched very inconspicuous may have some relevance to the hiding of their Catholic origins, but also it may just be to be inconspicuous and to be secretive almost, so there's that too. The Mother Goddess of the Holy Virgin Mary was very much beloved by the people and an important part of their lives, and no doubt the ritual still continued where words were spoken to her and acts of prayer were submitted to her and petitions for protection, and this was quite common amongst the people of the old religion, the old faith. It's easy to presume then that these marks were made entirely by Catholics, which were probably made mostly by Catholics, but there is some evidence that they're also quite a common occurrence even amongst Protestants. We can tell this by the room that was found in Knole House in Essex. Now, this room was prepared for the visit of King James I of England, King James VI of Scotland, to Knole House. They built a room for the visitation of the king, and the room itself was dated to 1606 in dendrochronology. Now, this was just after King James I had survived the Gunpowder Plot, which was an uprising by the Catholics led by Guy Fawkes to stop the holding of Parliament on the November the 5th. So they put the gunpowder there on November the 4th to prevent the holding of Parliament on November the 5th. And so this act must have caused some paranoia and nurtured King James I insecurity. And in Knole House they found many witch marks that had been inscribed into his room to offer him perhaps comfort and protection, knowing that he was protected from witchcraft.
In Knole there is a symbol of a net of 3 vertical lines and 3 diagonal lines crossing left and 3 diagonal lines crossing right underneath the floorboards. These are known as demon traps. They're symbols of protection all around the house. The symbolism is clear. It seems to be a net that catches the witch's spells.
So at the very beginning of his reign, King James I's fear of witchcraft had been nurtured by the very near drowning of his wife after their marriage in 1589. When on her wedding voyage, multiple storms had blown up that had prevented her travelling to Scotland, and she was forced to return to Norway on several occasions. It was rumoured that black magic had been sent to drown them, and this had affected the king greatly and nurtured his insecurities and paranoia at the very beginning of his step into power and freedom. Famously, King James VI was a vocal denouncer of witchcraft, writing his own book Demonology in 1597, publishing his own work on witchcraft demonology in 1597, and outlawing witchcraft entirely in 1604. In Knole there is a symbol of a net of 3 vertical lines with 3 diagonal lines crossing right to left and 3 diagonal lines crossing left to right, And these are known as demon traps, and this was found underneath the floorboards. Now, other symbols were found around the house, but the symbolism is clear that they are there to trap the evil spirits in a net. These symbols that were found around the house were found on the joists, they were found on the bed, they were found on the beams, and they were found on the ceiling of the room above, as well as under the floorboards. Other symbols found were scorch marks, VW marks, and demon traps. Now, these demon traps are there to stop the evil spells from entering and to catch them in their grip. They were thought to be placed there to protect the king on his visit, and although the king never did actually visit in the end, their making was obviously very deliberate and very considered. Were these marks to protect the king from the witchcraft that he feared and anticipated? The family fell out of favour at court and the king declined to visit. But these markings had been made very deliberately to protect the king from the witchcraft that he feared. So the best place to find witch markings arguably is Creswell Crags, where it has the potentially highest number of witch markings in the country. Now, these markings were originally thought to be graffiti, but it was later revealed that they were in fact witch markings, which dated from the earliest dated mark from 1505 and were continually made all throughout the 18th and right up until the 19th century. And then at this point, the tradition of making witch markings seems to have fallen out of practice. Until now, we cannot remember the very origins of these marks themselves. So when we're talking of witch markings, many of these marks were difficult and hidden and difficult to see. But when you go to Creswell Crags, you can see them very boldly and prolifically. Now, in the centre of this cave is a very deep hole, and it was something that possibly the villagers, because there used to be a village built under the cliffs into the caves, these people were perhaps scared of this hole into hell. It was a very deep chasm, obviously quite a dangerous spot as well, and around whatever they were scared of coming out of this hole, they put a lot of protection marks and reworked these marks for hundreds of years. So we talked about the symbols such as flower patterns or circle patterns, the hexafoil, the daisy wheel, which is a common mark and is also ancient and can be found in Egypt. The idea is similarly entrapment of spirits, following the lines so that they get trapped within an endless circle or within an endless shape, representing the journey that it cannot escape. Concentric circles, which appear too. The daisy wheel, it has been suggested, is an ancient symbol of the sun and light, and here the symbolism may be light that drives out the darkness. This seems to be unpopular amongst historians. Many buildings have revealed a curious custom of scorch marks on beams, around doors, windows and the hearth. These are too prevalent to be accidental candle marks, and they appear in places where no candle was ever placed. These scorch marks took repeated burnings into wood as a deliberate act. But why scorch the wood? It has been suggested again as a symbol of light, keeping out the darkness. It has also been seen as a protection against fire by deliberately burning the beams of the house. I imagine that these marks were not made without some ritual enactment, some kind of chanting, some kind of charm, but again we can only speculate how these marks were made. We know nothing about their actual ceremony. All we know is that they deliberately and ritualistically seem to have made these marks in obscure places. John Dee, however, was a famous alchemist in the court of Elizabeth I, and he has left his table for posterity, and this table bears an enormous scorch mark of huge proportions upon it. And he was a mystic at the time of James I originally, and is rumoured to have learnt his magical arts in Norway. The mark is said to be where the devil left his hoof. Now maybe again this refers in some way to fixing of the devil's hoof, which I mentioned in the video about horseshoes, or else I can see it the laming of the devil. Now, fire was often burned deep into the wood with repeated removal of the hard burnt woods to make the scorch mark deeper, and the scorch mark of John Dee is a very large and deep mark. Now, John Dee could be said to be a cunning man, a cunning person, and cunning people often made use of prayers in healing and ritual charms. And often this involved passing to their client magical talismans made with magical words on magical symbols, and these also can be found in old buildings. The trouble with finding artifacts left in buildings is that often these only turn up during renovation work, and quite often these are not reported at all. People don't understand what they found, and they get thrown away. So we only have a few reports of these artefacts being found, although we are now gathering a database that people are adding to when they find curious things in their old buildings. It's very interesting the amount of artefacts that can be found around the country, and not only in the country but throughout Europe, the Americas and Australia as well. Many objects have been found in relation to magical acts of home protection or Apotropaic Magic. And these are curious finds like shoes in old chimneys on a old chimney ledge, dolls, children's toys, we have cats bricked into the walls of houses, and we have horses' skulls beneath floorboards of old houses, as well as witches' bottles have been found beneath floorboards in front of the hearth very often. Now, we do not know very much about the Pendle witches, returning to the Pendle witches, but in 2011 an old house was found in Lancashire that was dated to the 1600s, that contained an old fireplace, an old hearth, and a room that was bricked up into a wall in which a cat had been placed. And there was a lot of speculation at the time that they had found the house of the Pendle witches. Now, this has later been disproved, and where we think the Pendle witches actually lived is at Malkin Tower Farm, which is, according to the Forest of Bowland site, Malkin Tower Farm is located in Blackow, on the side of a hill looking down towards roughly Barrowford and Colne. And if you look at that spot on Google Maps, it's an amazing spot. I would have liked to film there, sorry my car broke down. And it's very much on top of the hill. There's Blackow Tower, and then there's a beautiful view down to Pendle Hill, a magical Pendle Hill. The original house that they found the dried cat in was found by United Utilities at Blackmoss Reservoir, and was later recovered in 2012 and is still under the soil there.
The ritual act of burying a cat in the walls of a building has been encountered in many places. There is also the curious custom of burying a horse's skull beneath the floor in Ireland. The practice was said to improve acoustics and the sound of dancing feet, but there are suggestions of an ancient ritual practice of sacrifice upon the foundation of a building, and an animal offered to land spirits for the dwelling and the land that's about to be lived on.
Cats, of course, are magical creatures, associated with witches as creatures of the night, with strange otherworldly eyes that light up or slink away into the darkness, seemingly with the ability to appear and disappear. So the cat is the familiar of the witch, and burying them within a building may link this otherworldly familiar to the protection of the otherworldly aspect of a witch somehow. Cats are considered protective creatures and able to see in the dark and to see spirits. Black cats particularly are renowned for having great perception, and you can often see cats just staring away into a corner at something that isn't there, that you cannot see. Sometimes you can see what's there, and I will tell you that when you can see what's there, the cat is very much in that place with you, also seeing what's there, and it's quite nice to have that protective cat by your side at that point. That's personal speculation. Anyway, cats are guardians. They protect. They protect the home, and are linked in that way to protective spirits. Now, to us, these are gruesome and revile practices. Who possibly would want to kill a cat or put a cat alive in a building, in a wall? It could only be witches. But it seems that this practice may have been a bit more widespread, and it may actually have been carried out by builders. Quite often there's remnants of this when there's building work done. It may be some kind of tradition that was passed along. It may have something to do with an original sacrifice, an animal sacrifice, or even a human sacrifice upon the land to prepare the way for taking over that land and putting a dwelling on it. It was to appease the land spirits. So there is this notion, especially when you find things like horses' heads under floorboards. This was said in Ireland to create better acoustics, but often these horses' heads are found by the hearth, which is the centre of the home, the altar of the home, the place of fire and spirit and life, and seems to be a sacred place of the home itself, the very foundation of that home. Coming back to the cats sometimes were dead, sometimes perhaps accidental deaths, sometimes very definitely placed there, and sometimes placed there held together by wire, as if hunting, as if catching a rat or a mouse. So there is that protection of the home as well, perhaps protecting the home from vermin and from rodents, and from the blight of your crop, basically. The cat and the horse are both otherworldly animals, and the horse is curious in that it's said to enable spirit flight. In Celtic and Norse cultures particularly, the horse is a very revered animal for being the steed of the shaman, the bringer of spirit flight to the shaman. The connection with dancing and acoustics could be something to do with riding the rhythm of the horse's hooves into spirit world. So there is that connection too, although it could just be passed off as an old traditional custom to hide its origins, to hide its original animal sacrifice foundation. What we can say is that scholars don't often have a definitive answer. Other animals have been found buried too, and sometimes symbolic objects have been found, such as a figurine of a cat that was found, or something protective that referred to this sacrifice from ages past but had been changed and updated. So when it comes to symbolic things that have been found in the home, one of the most curious is probably shoes. And shoes have been found very often placed not only in fireplaces, but in attics and in the walls, along with other strange objects, all sorts of strange objects. So shoes have been found in very strange places, attics and fireplaces, on the ledge, on a fireplace. And adults and children's shoes have been found here, and these are well-worn shoes that have the shape and imprint of the individual on them. Sometimes there is just a single shoe. Now there seems to be no rational explanation for these finds other than them being ritual acts of protection, magical house protection, magical individual protection. The idea is that the shoe is a substitute, a symbolic substitute for the individual, and it is possible to catch the demon in the shoe instead of in the individual's life. Now, this shoe may seem to be a bizarre object, but in magic it has been supposed that the foot and the step and the shoe itself represents the life path of an individual. A person was said to be able to hex somebody by driving a nail into their footprint, and thus stopping them in their tracks. So the footprint is a very individual mark, the imprint of a person. The earliest, I'm going to take my shoes off because I'm boiling, and therefore have a look at my lovely shoe. I'd leave this croc somewhere in my house, maybe in the attic. Date this croc quite accurately, I'm pretty sure. It also makes a great thumbnail. Okay, so the earliest concealed shoe was said to be discovered behind the stalls in Winchester Cathedral and dates to 1308. I want to put my own oar in this. So in the tale of Cinderella, Cinderella loses one shoe. When the two shoes are reunited, Cinderella can take her place in her new life, on her new path, as it were. So could the shoe then represent the life path of an individual, or their birth to death journey, their destiny almost? So it has been said that the figure of Cinderella with one shoe on and one shoe off represents the shaman who can enter with one foot in each world, who can live life with one foot placed on each path, a spiritual path and a physical path. Now, the wild shamanic world and this human world is often depicted in an upside downness kind of way. In some traditions, shamans would wear clothes back to front, inside out, or would wear women's clothes or a different sex's clothes, or in some way, such as in the tale of Ragnar and Queen Auslug, clothes that are neither this thing nor that. And this crops up in storytelling quite often. And this is to symbolise the going within, or the contrary movement to the normal world, to the human world. So a shoe that has been placed inside a chimney could be some kind of protective act of placing an individual's life force there as a spirit trap. Or it could represent that individual's life path and protection upon that individual's life path. I also wonder if there's some more to it, something to do with spirit flight, but I'll come back to that in a minute. The evil could attack the shoe and get trapped within, and this tale stems from popular medieval saint who was an unofficial saint from 1313, I think, and he was John Sean of Buckinghamshire, and he was said to have trapped the devil in his boots. He was very popular in the medieval times, and we could actually relate this placing of a shoe and the trapping of a devil with this popular saint and this popular superstition. But perhaps there is some other kind of association with the shoe. Perhaps the single shoe may take on a topsy-turvy path, something that confuses or traps an evil spirit. Of course, I can only speculate, or we can only speculate. Many people say the shoes represent an individual and a part of them that is unique to them. By placing a worn shoe where spirits enter, perhaps it was thought the spirit would attack the shoe and not the individual, or be trapped in the shoe and not get out. I like to speculate that there could possibly be other reasons, such as entrapping and then roasting a spirit up a chimney place, something that we often see in the roasting of a heart with pins, which is to return the evil to sender and to literally keep roasting them with their own malign intentions. Probably some unconventional act of spirit flight, spirit flying, some kind of enabling symbolic magic, which would put it in another category to apotropaic magic perhaps, but I'm just speculating on if you have any other thoughts on what these symbolic acts are. Then I would be really interested if you could put them in the comments below. Things like putting a shoe, putting toys, putting dolls in walls of houses. What do you think that was about? Now, when it comes to putting dolls as apotropaic acts of magic in buildings and toys, there is definitely a symbolic representation to childhood, such as putting child shoes in a chimney. Now, I've not got very much to say about dolls. I am just going to quote Wikipedia, and it says here in Wikipedia about dolls that the Greeks made offerings to averting gods called the Apotropaic, who were chthonic deities and heroes who granted safety and deflected evil. And they gave offerings for the protection of these infants, who wore on them amulets with apotropaic powers, and committed the child to the care of the kurotrophic child-nurturing deities. So, the use of baby dolls, baby shoes, may have some ancient superstitious connotation or rite for protecting the children of the home, the young children, the future generations of the house. Again, may be seen as spirit traps. Witches' bottles. Now, witches' bottles have been found buried in houses and in other places, outside the house, under the doorstep, been found in barns, they've been found in various places, but quite often they're buried in front of the hearth. Now, witches' bottles are an act of sympathetic magic, very obviously, because what was often used was a Bellarmine jar which had a face on it. It's not always what was used, sometimes a glass bottle was used. And within this jar very often is found something pertaining to that person. It's very often urine, or it could be some nail clippings or a piece of hair, but it represents the person, the individual themselves. And then within the jar are also found things like nails and pins, and these have been deliberately bent before they were placed in the witch's bottle. Now, the act of bending the nails first, it could indicate some kind of hook or barb that would catch an evil spirit, or it may, as Brian Hoggard suggests, represent the killing of those nails, the killing of that pin, in the same way that an Iron Age deposit was placed in a lake, being deliberately broken, the end of that person's life, the end of that power. Pins have been found in there, and then they have been buried, and the idea is to keep the urine warm. Now, we do actually have a description of witches' bottles. This earliest description comes from Suffolk in 1681 and was written in Joseph Glanville's Seducemus Triumphatus, or Evidence Concerning Witches and Apparitions. And he says,
For an old man that travelled up and down the country and had some acquaintance at that house, calling in and asking the man of the house how he did and his wife. He told him that himself was well, but his wife had been a long time in languishing condition, and that she was haunted with a thing in the shape of a bird that would flare near to her face, and that she could not enjoy her natural rest well. The old man bid him and his wife be of good courage, but it was a dead sprite, he said, and he would put him in a course to rid his wife of this languishment and trouble. He therefore advised him to take a cork and put his wife's urine into it, together with pins and needles and nails, and cork them up and set the bottle to the fire well cooked, which when it had felt the heat of the fire began to move and joggle a little. But he for sureness took the fire shovel and held it hard upon the cork, and as he thought he felt something one while on this side, another while on that, shoved the fire shovel off, which he still quickly put up again. But at last at one shoving the cork bounced out, and the urine, pins, nails and needles all flew up, and gave a report like a pistol, and his wife continued in the same trouble and languishment still. Not long after, the old man came to the house again, and inquired of the man of the house how his wife did, who answered as ill as ever, if not worse. He asked him if he had followed his direction. Yes, says he, and he told him the event as is above said. Ah, quoth he, it seems it was too nimble for you, but now I will put you in a way that will make the business sure. Take your wife's urine as before and cork it in a bottle with the nails, pins and needles and bury it in the earth, and that will do the feat. The man did accordingly, and his wife began to mend sensibly, and in a competent time was finally well recovered. But there came a woman from a town some miles off to a house with a lamentable outcry that they had killed her husband. They asked her what she meant, and thought her distracted, telling her that they knew neither her nor her husband. Yes, saith she, you have killed my husband. He told me so on his deathbed. But at last they understood by her that her husband was a wizard, and has bewitched this man's wife, and that this counter practice prescribed by the old man, which saved the man's wife from languishment, was the death of that wizard that had bewitched her.
What can we say about magic and witchcraft then? Well, personally, I am going to say that customs of these kinds are protective acts against magic, but also acts of magic in themselves, and the lines often become quite blurred between what is witchcraft and what is not witchcraft. What we can see are strange and creepy objects, and things like cats placed in walls and dolls placed in houses that seemingly have no other purpose than some ritual act of protection. These may have been considered Christian at the time, or maybe even only half Christian perhaps, but they were very prevalent and can be found throughout Europe. The symbols seem to occur mostly between the 13th and the 19th century, when for some reason in the 19th century they fell out of fashion. Perhaps they were seen as primitive and barbaric now, or perhaps it has something to do with the industrialisation of society and the way that society moved away from the rural areas and into more industrialised zones. Maybe this reflects a change in thinking. For some reason in the 19th century they then fell out of favour. Many finds and trinkets have not yet been recorded, but we can say that these finds are extensive, and things like shoes and witches' marks are still turning up and being recorded to this day. The folk practices of our forebears often seem unclear and primitive to us, and we can call it superstition or witchcraft. It is sad that we often lose simple knowledge to forgetfulness and we cannot answer our own questions. Folk magic was widespread and perhaps part prayer and perhaps part prevention. This can be seen in historical and archaeological records, but the question remains, things like why do we blow out the candles on birthday cakes, and why do we gift a bride a horseshoe or tie a shoe onto the back of their car? We cannot always answer the questions, but the thing is, the tradition still lives on and we still participate in these ritual acts. Thanks for watching The Witch in the Woods. I hope you found that of some interest. Please do engage in discussion in the comments below. I find this a really fascinating subject. I feel like I've got a nice home here. It was built in the 1860s, and I think that is still possibly the time of finding things in your home. I think somebody went into my attic and said there was something up there, and I wish I remembered what he said. He might have said it was a shoe. But I'd like to think there's some little acts of protection around this home, keeping the energies good and the vibes good. Do you feel that about your house? Maybe you want to change the vibes by adding some simple acts of protection. Anyway, thanks for the discussion. Hope you're all well, and I'll speak to you all again soon. Cheers, bye.